Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine and I'm joined now by Alex Stewart.
Good morning, Joe.
And Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hello, Joe.
Today we are going to be discussing broad themes from the games. Again, we record too far away from the weekend to get away with this being a What Happened at the Weekend podcast, so that's why we pretend that they're about broad themes, and then we do the same thing that everyone else does, but maybe in a different way, a little bit more fun. I tell you, we've got Newcastle, Brighton coming up. I tell you, we have Chelsea, Liverpool, Southampton, Tottenham, which I didn't watch, but of course, here we have a fan of either club in Alex and Seb, so that'll be exciting. Do you know what I know definitely is exciting?
Is it The Athletic?
I feel like there's no excitement in the way that there once was around that sort of line. But so I'm going to try it one more time. And Alex, I want to hear from you, and Seb at the same time, please. Do you know what I know is exciting?
The Athletic.
Yeah. It works, doesn't it? It's a bit like asking the room if that's really the loudest they can clap, which everyone has loved since the 90s. Yes, it is The Athletic, and everyone's loved The Athletic since the 90s, which is technically impossible because it wasn't around before 5 years ago. But I think people, they had this idea in their head that one day would be born, and they always knew it was going to work before, people realised the realities of modern media and the industry. But they always knew, I think in the future there's going to be incredible and amazing sports journalism available for such a small price. And back then, of course, people were paying for newspapers, and they spent double digits monthly on stuff. Not the case now. Obviously, people have grown used to. I'm doing a history of media. This is gone too far. The Athletic is the best place for sports journalism online, and for the entirety of September, you can join with a £1 introductory fee. So I would highly encourage that you do that, and you can do so by visiting theathletic.com/Tifo. That's theathletic.com/Tifo for all your sporting needs. I think there's 11 sports that we cover. There's a dedicated journalist for each Premier League team. We have some for the Championship too. Hey, we've even got one for the Bundesliga in Rafa Harnigstein. I just like to sing that before his name. I didn't forget it. And of course, La Liga and Serie A too. Lots of people, and lots of experts, I should say. And I'm finding it really difficult to round this bit up. Can someone just step in and just take over and
just do your awkward silence bit. Just stop talking and then leave sort of 15 seconds of dead air. And then I think everyone will be kind of suitably prepared for what happens next.
Going to leave you in the warm hands and the cool embrace of Alex Stewart and Seb Stafford-Bloor. Okay, let us begin with Newcastle-Brighton. Newcastle-Brighton, a wonderful game of exciting football. Not if you're a Newcastle fan, of course. It was an awful game if you're a Newcastle fan. But it was a wonderful game if you were a Brighton fan or a neutral. And I'd like to kick off proceedings by talking about Tariq Lamptey, if I may. Because I think, we mentioned him last week. Well, actually, we didn't mention him. I accidentally put him in the title of the podcast because I thought I talked about him. Because I really liked him.
That, actually.
And I didn't talk about him, which is weird. But what a player. Oh, my God. It's very, very exciting. I get thrills and chills when he gets the ball. Can I say... he had the run on Saint-Maximin for the entire 33 minutes that Saint-Maximin was on that pitch. The moment, I think it was the moment that Saint-Maximin was injured, Tariq Lamptey, who can only be 5'6" or 5'7" or something, if that, turned him inside, almost like a sort of rotating Russian doll, and through sort of, I don't know, breaking the laws of physics, managed to shrug off this much larger man. He has the strength, he has the pace. There's no way if Newcastle watched Brighton's first performance last weekend that they wouldn't have said to Saint-Maximin, if you are playing in this position, you must track back with Tariq Lamptey, because clearly he started the season brightly. He's obviously going to be a threat. And what was it within the first few minutes? He's the reason for Saint-Maximin is the reason for the conceded penalty, which Tariq Lamptey of course won. I'm very excited about him, and I wonder Alex, I know you've got some stuff to talk about him too. But first, Seb, I wonder, is it possible that this is an example of a player who's kind of exploded onto the scene and hasn't left enough time for opposition clubs to treat him purposefully or deal with him effectively? Or do you think that this is just a player who can do everything? I mean, he's a tenacious defender. He's exceptionally fast. He just seems to cut through defenders on his way into the box. He has no fear. I just love watching him. What do you expect from him this season? Is this a blip?
Well, no, I think blip's the wrong word. I think whenever a player emerges, you've always got to give a little bit of time to opposition teams to adjust around him and start game planning. But there's no need to be negative. I mean, everything he's done so far has been really positive. None more so than the decision to leave Chelsea in the first place. I love it when a player takes control of their career. So his situation was that he had 6 months left on his deal, and Chelsea were keen to extend him, but that he believed, partly because of Reece James's emergence, that his pathway to the first team wasn't clear enough, and so he was determined to leave, hence the very, very small fee. And I just really like that mindset. It's very sort of Jadon Sancho-esque, is just to say, right, this is going to be me. I'm going to go out, I'm going to make a career and a name for myself, and I'm going to be proactive. I just really admire it.
Yeah, okay. Alex, what do you make of him as a player?
I'm genuinely quite excited to watch his development. I mean, obviously, the thing with Lamptey that catches the eye is the speed with which he carries the ball and his ability to take defenders on. But I think there are a couple of other things that are really interesting. As you've said, his one-on-one defence is really impressive. There are a couple of instances where not only did he make last-ditch tackles, but he was coming inside to cover across. On the right-hand side, Ben White was getting forwards quite significantly for Brighton as almost a, dare I say it, overlapping centre-back. And Lamptey had the awareness and the speed to be able to cover that space in behind, which is really impressive. He also did it centrally against Chelsea, tracking back and making a couple of tackles. He also, I think, which is really interesting, given that he is very, very quick and he is very good at taking players on, he isn't always bombing forwards. He will quite happily sort of sit around the halfway line and patiently wait for the play to develop before making his move. So he's not the sort of wing back who is just trying to get forwards and use his pace. He has a sense positionally of where he's supposed to be. He worked really, really well, particularly with Trossard, either staying wide or coming inside if Trossard was moving out. White was able to find him with a couple of really, really nice penetrating through passes that he was able to cut in field on. One last thing I think that's interesting is a couple of times his throw-ins were really good. There was one instance where he did a throw-in that managed to get the ball basically to the edge of the Newcastle box by taking it quite quickly and throwing it quite flat. And he seems like a player, I know that's maybe an odd instance to highlight, but it all speaks to me of a player who will be categorised as somebody who is fast and good at dribbling and good at taking on players. But actually, there's a lot of game intelligence there already. And I think under a coach like Graham Potter, and particularly playing, with Ben White behind and inside of him, he's going to develop into somebody who's really, really good, because that kind of game intelligence is much harder to teach, and it looks like he's already got it.
I'm very excited. And also we can use Tariq Lamptey to segue into the next part of this conversation with Brighton, because in the second half, obviously they were 2-0 up at the point. Tariq Lamptey, who I think may have picked up a knock. I was watching with the sound off at that point. It looked like it. But anyway, Brighton wanted to change their system. They took off Tariq Lamptey for Dan Burn, which incidentally I think might be in contention for the greatest height differential in any substitution ever, where the player is essentially going to the same position.
Isn't it? Yeah,
it's huge. Honestly, it just watching Dan Burn play is just weird because he makes everyone else look like a child. It's like watching, junior football or under 16s or something, where one of the players has matured much, much more than everyone else. But Dan Burn is just an extra man. I think that's what they call him. But I was curious about this because Brighton's system to that point had worked really well because they played a 3-4-3 or a 3-4-2-1, I think, really in the first half against Newcastle's 4-4-2, and repeatedly they were able to just pass the ball straight through one or even in some cases two of Newcastle's defensive lines, and I do appreciate that also speaks to the system, but also speaks to Newcastle's inability to defend in this game, or really to press down, or to know what to do. And when Tariq Lamptey was on the pitch, and I think it was Hendricks on the other side, wasn't it? That Newcastle's midfield was just so spread that there was so much space in the middle. So I was a bit surprised when they changed the formation. Seb and I were chatting about it at the time. They changed, I think, to a 4-4-2 when they brought Dan Burn on, who played at left back, played at right back, sorry. And I think, Seb, your point was to say that maybe this is just like having four centre-back type players on the pitch to defend a lead for the last 30 minutes of the game, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like because I was watching the game on a delay, I was a little bit prejudiced by your spoiler, so I was sort of looking out for the substitution. But it felt to me as if it was Graham Potter saying that Newcastle have created nothing. The only way they're really going to get back into this game is through a set piece. Through some sort of law of averages type of football. And Dan Burn was a kind of an answer to that. He is the extra centre-back. He makes it a little bit harder to create anything from a set piece. It's also like, I mean, I feel like we might be being a little bit disrespectful to him because he had a very good season last year. And
Dan
the
Burn?
oddity, yeah, I felt
How are we being disrespectful? I complimented him on being an extra man.
I feel like maybe our conversation was at the time because we said, well, sort of the only virtue to him is to kind of to put him in as an extra obelisk at the back, and in reality, like you kind of, because of his height and because of the weird little dynamic of seeing such a tall player playing in a fullback position, it has this sort of novelty value which distracts from what a competent defender he actually is. But I think in this instance, it was a measure to protect a winning position. Brighton had their game won. The only way they weren't going to finish with all 3 points was if something silly happened, and it was just a smart move. I mean, I don't know what influence Lamptey's injury played in that, or whether that decision would have been made had he not picked up a knock. But it just felt smart. It was one of those where this is the right change being made at the right time.
It speaks volumes, I suppose, of Graham Potter, doesn't it? Certainly if we're going to take it in that fashion, because they were so dominant in the game. And again, I don't want to be disrespectful to Newcastle, but Newcastle were not in this game of football. No. Certainly for the first half. In the second half, they improved, and I think as the system changed, they found more time on the ball. They were able to string some passes together. But it wasn't responding to any kind of threat. It was preempting a possible threat, and I think that's the thing that's smart. I would like to talk about Newcastle for a moment because you mentioned set pieces there. I stole this statistic from the commentary team, so those watching the game will have heard it. But apparently last season, 37% of Newcastle's goals came from set pieces, right? And also they had they were the team with the lowest XG across the course of the season. They had a number of corners towards the end of this game, and I appreciate that obviously bringing on Dan Burn and having a tall Brighton backline was going to help that. Newcastle's set pieces looked completely toothless to me. And that is very worrying if they had the team with the lowest XG of the entire season anyway, and 37% of the goals they did score came from set pieces, and those corners looked bad. That would be a slightly worrying sign for me. I would also say that I thought, I think I mentioned this to you at the time, Seb, as well. I've noticed for the first time the lack of crowd, and I think that's because of Callum Wilson, new signing, his first game at St James's Park, which I know there's a bit of a cliche about Newcastle and strikers, and but presumably like one of the reasons to sign for Newcastle is to go and play in front of that crowd, and your debut at St James's Park would be a memorable occasion, right? That's the sort of thing I hear players saying that they remember. So I really do wonder if that would have had would have been either had an impact on the way that the game was played, or just have been kind of sad in a way for Callum Wilson, who looked frustrated throughout the game because he barely touched the ball and didn't really have any service, and was sort of chasing it down valiantly, but very rarely got into positions with any more than what you might call a fifth of a chance or a quarter of a chance.
That's a really interesting point, Joe, because I think if you take away the crowd and the environment and the kind of the mythology of St James's Park, you're not left with an awful lot at the moment. What I will say is that as a result of that game in the aftermath, I think Newcastle and particularly Steve Bruce were particularly fortunate there were no supporters in the ground, because there's behind the scenes there's been this kind of continuous back and forth between loyal members of the press and the fans over what Steve Bruce's role is and how effective a manager is and how deserving he is of his position. Obviously it comes with a caveat that maybe the lack of a crowd takes away the home advantage. There's a pretty good Tifo video which explores that concept that Alex wrote a few months ago. It's a nice little plug. But I feel like in that kind of situation, no matter how good a coach Graham Potter is and how talented a team he's building at Brighton, losing 3-0 at home to that kind of side, that is kind of the precursor to a fairly toxic atmosphere. And that would have transcended, sort of any novelty of, Callum Wilson playing there or any traditional fondness for number 9s or goal scorers. So it's really interesting. That set piece statistic is, I feel like that's front and center of the argument against Bruce, is that there isn't an awful lot going on there. Again, this is something that got touched on in the Sensible Transfers video that Alex did. But if you take away those avenues, what's actually left there? What are the routes to goal? What is happening under the hood of that Newcastle first 11? There's not an awful lot beyond. We've made a joke of it in the past about how the main sort of device of attack is to give the ball to Alan Saint-Maximin, 60 yards from goal, hope he beats 6 players and scores the best goal of his career every time.
Well, if he's stuck pinned by Tariq Lamptey, then he's 80 yards from goal. Do you know what I mean? Like, if it's as simple as that to try and stop it. Also, like, I cannot understand. I haven't watched Newcastle enough to say this with any real confidence. But from the evidence of this game, if you're going to play a 2-man midfield against a 3-man or what's effectively a 3-man midfield, then John Joe Shelby cannot be one of those people.
Exactly.
Because he just. As I said, maybe this is a one-off thing, and maybe the 2 goals in the game were so early that obviously that just completely changes the mentality, that completely changes the game plan. In a way, it's difficult to learn anything long-lasting from a game where the first 2 goals come in the first 10 minutes, right? But I just felt like he didn't really chase any balls, or he didn't know where he was supposed to be defensively. And I've never criticised his ability to pass. I think he's a fantastic passer. I'm sure if he was afforded the space and the time, he'd be able to find Callum Wilson, and that could be a regular duo. But it seemed really problematic to me. If I was a Newcastle supporter, particularly after the disappointment of the summer, not the transfer window. I mean, the expectation around the takeover. I think the transfer window has been actually more exciting than it ordinarily would be for Newcastle. And Jamal Lewis is a very, very good player too.
It's been a very productive transfer window actually for Newcastle. It hasn't. The only problem is that sort of they went into the summer with this expectation of a kind of a Manchester City style transfer window, one of those kind of early days of a takeover where, it's like the dynamic is of a teenager cheating on Championship Manager. And because it hasn't lived up to that, the sort of, it's obscured just how much better it has been than the kind of the mean window that has become typical under Ashley. Jamal Lewis is a really good player. I think Wilson's a good player. Like I accept the problems with his injury history. But on the basis of what's happened in the past, it's a hell of an improvement, actually. And you could make an argument for saying that that whatever the disadvantages of having no fans inside St James's Park, the effect is to kind of create a controlled environment, to take all the kind of the variables and intangibles out of the equation, and what you're left with is a fairly unflattering picture of what life is like under Steve Bruce.
Yeah. Okay, well, a quick one before we move on. I would like to mention Neil Maupay, who is very, very exciting to watch, and I cannot believe how deep that man drops. It's almost as deep as Kai Havertz. Also, I thought that Basuma was amazing in this game. Apart from kicking Jamal Lewis in the face, I thought he was really, really good. So, Alex, I'll be excited to see your take on Brighton in video form this season.
I mean, that's sort of up to you, isn't it?
If
you tell me to do it, then I'll.
That's the podcast version of a commission, right there.
Okay, great, noted. Yeah. I'll put that on my little yellow notepad.
I'm gonna chip in on Basuma. I think there's a 30-40 million pound player there in a year or two. I think that's the red card is just a freak. Like, you obviously didn't mean it. It's one of the strangest things I've actually seen. I try and imagine my leg bending in that position, and I think that if it ever were to, I'd probably end up in hospital.
I also love that I know this was pointed out at the time, but that he didn't really react to his red card. He stayed with Jamal Lewis because he was horrified at what happened. He didn't react to being sent off. He just like, yeah, fair enough, I'm really sorry, and he stuck around. Seems like a nice guy.
Does indeed, and maybe that adds an extra 250 grand to his value, possibly.
I think it probably takes some off. If certainly Jose Mourinho isn't going to buy him, isn't he?
Mourinho's not going to want a nice player. Yeah.
No. Okay. When we come back, we will talk about Chelsea versus Liverpool. We're back. We're going to talk about Chelsea versus Liverpool. The first point that I would like someone other than me to make, and I'm going to take it to Alex, I think. Liverpool supporters have been saying, over the summer that perhaps a new centre-back is in order. And of course, there are a couple of injuries in that department anyway. Joel Matip out for slightly longer, we think. So Fabinho deputised, stood in the back line, and it had some very satisfying results, didn't it, Alex?
Yeah, Fabinho did very well. It's worth noting that he did play as a right back for Monaco before being signed by Liverpool, so he has regular experience playing as a defender, not simply as a makeshift one. He actually transitioned into being a defensive midfielder. So that sort of innate awareness of defensive responsibilities is very much there.
Like the offside line or something.
Yeah, and positional relationships within a back four, because Monaco played a back four. So, that it's probably a less tricky transition for somebody who has, a couple of seasons, if not more, under their belt playing as a defender. And I think he played occasionally as a centre-back. But he's got, the thing with Fabinho that is impressive is that his one-on-one defending, particularly against Werner in that game, was really good. So there were a couple of instances where quite early on he showed Werner outside. He was able to get his body in the way and then win a foul off that. There was another instance where he was even further behind Werner, actually. Werner was in a lot of space, and Werner started to come inside, and Fabinho was aware that Van Dijk was making ground behind him, and therefore he was actually quite happy to let Werner come inside, because he knew that would then become a 2-on-1, and he would be able to defend it as well. So I don't know whether that's an instance of Klopp having worked really hard on this in training, in the run-up to the game, or whether Fabinho just has enough intelligence and enough kind of awareness of how Liverpool play to be able to dovetail into that system really neatly. Of course, the other thing that, Fabinho is a very athletic player, but he also has this good range of passing that we've seen from the defensive midfield position. And that, again, facilitates what Liverpool try to do with these kind of direct vertical build-up plays from, either Fabinho or Van Dijk. So it seems like, sometimes when you have, obviously, last season, Fernandinho played at centre-back a lot for Manchester City, and that really seemed to rob City of the kind of intelligence and physicality that Fernandinho brings at the base of that midfield three. This didn't seem to be an issue for Liverpool, and of course that's partly because Jordan Henderson, or later on in the game Thiago, could fit into that pivot role really neatly. So you're not just moving a player back who's capable of taking the role. You also have enough cover ahead of that it doesn't upset the system too much. I think as well it's interesting, there was a good thread on Twitter somebody did last week about some of the issues that Joe Gomez has positionally. Gomez is quite a front foot defender. He likes to come out and make interceptions. He's a lot more proactive as a defender than Van Dijk is. And sometimes that does lead to him getting dragged wide or forwards, and then you can exploit the space in behind that. I think Fabinho seems a little bit more settled, a little bit less rash possibly. And so, this is the sort of, not experiment because it's been forced on them, but given that Keita is fit, Wijnaldum's in the squad, Oxlade-Chamberlain's in the squad, there's enough depth in midfield that it's entirely possible that Fabinho will actually remain at centre-back for a little while, and maybe that'll iron out some of Liverpool's defensive issues.
Also, I would say that I think based on how high Liverpool's back line was, Fabinho was kind of playing in the same place of the pitch that he would normally be. I don't know, it seemed manically high to me. Like, you could see with the kind of, even with the zoomed in TV angle camera, you could see when Chelsea were attempting to play out of their back from the goalkeeper, and Liverpool's front four were pressing. Whenever they did make it through that front four and the press stopped, there were two lines of a kind of flat midfield and the defence that were, I mean, like 6 yards from each other. And it caused problems. You mentioned a couple of times, like those one-on-ones between Fabinho and Timo Werner, which were very interesting to watch. And I think Fabinho definitely came out the better as far as the game goes. But it does seem a little reckless, doesn't it? Alex, I assume it's just to compress that space so that if the press is broken, that the ball is much less easy to break with. Is that why? Can you just explain why they would be so high to me?
Yeah, it's completely that. Liverpool's pressing system, as we've talked about in videos before, has changed over time, and now the front three are more responsible for marking passing lanes, and the midfield three are more responsible for kind of almost man orienting. And you could see in the early stages of that game how Wijnaldum and Keita would basically go man for man against Chelsea's midfield, and Henderson would sweep in behind that. I think we saw over the weekend, two instances of teams playing very high defensive lines, Liverpool and Southampton, with varying degrees of success. And part of the reason for that is that, Alisson is very good at sweeping in behind, McCarthy arguably less so. I know we'll come to talk about that game later on, but a couple of times McCarthy's judgment in committing to coming out to gather the ball was, he didn't commit, and that caused Southampton problems. But also with Van Dijk and Fabinho, you have two much quicker central defenders than Bednarek and Stevens, and so Liverpool are gambling on the fact that if they condense the space and make it much harder to play through that midfield and defensive line, even if it does happen with certainly Van Dijk and Fabinho or Gomez or whoever it happens to be, they have the pace to be able to recover those positions and get bodies back. And other teams will gamble on compressing the space in the same sort of way. But if they don't have the pace at centre-back, like Southampton don't currently, it's less successful.
Okay, I would like to talk about Jordan Henderson as well, Alex, because his flat driven ball for the red card, Christensen's red card, and what probably otherwise would have been a Mane goal, because it's not an ability that he's normally associated with, is it?
What, passing? No,
passing with such lovely consequences.
Passing with flair and style. No, it's interesting because I think you have within that Liverpool midfield, you have some very technically capable players who are perhaps, I don't want to say reduced because they perform their functions extremely well, but as Liverpool have gravitated more towards generating chances from the wide players, particularly the fullbacks, using the pace of that, particularly the two front wide players running in behind, the requirement for Liverpool's midfield to progress the ball has lessened, and so you don't see that sort of thing happening quite so much. But actually, they are capable of it. Henderson is capable of really good range of passing. Keita is capable of dribbling, carrying the ball, breaking the press, that kind of stuff. It's just that Liverpool's midfield currently aren't really asked to do that. But they do still have it. And I think that's really important. It's one of the reasons why Thiago is going to be able to slot in. Thiago does offer perhaps a slightly greater range of passing than anyone who's in there, but it's more of an awareness that Liverpool's midfield can do this stuff, that they have options if they need to deviate from what is a remarkably effective plan A. And Henderson's pass was kind of just a reminder that plan B already exists. It's just that Liverpool often don't need to use it.
Yeah, I mean, that's some incredible flexing, if that is the case. Seb, I know that we've talked about Jordan Henderson before, and you think, people often describe him in terminology related to him as a character rather than as a player, right?
I think so, Joe, and I understand I understand why that is, because Jordan Henderson is always the first person to reach a Liverpool goal scorer. He's the most visible part of any photograph that follows a goal being scored. That's the nature of him. But I think that comes at the expense of an appreciation for what he is able to do technically. And I think, although Christensen and Kepa received their fair share of criticism for the situation which led to the red card and which ultimately changed the game, I think that's kind of a ball that has no answer, that pass, because it's so flat, it's so well positioned, and it was quite well disguised too. That the only two outcomes from it are either a goal for Sadio Mane or a red card for either the centre half or the goalkeeper. So that's wonderful. And I feel like it was nice to have that right at the beginning of the season. It kind of, because when Jordan Henderson was voted as the FWA's Player of the Year, there was almost a retaliation to it. Like it was a kind of an honorary award, a sort of, well done for just being, the captain of this side. Whereas I felt that was a little bit of a disservice to someone that has grown as a player, that has adapted to just about everything he's been asked to do during his Liverpool career, which, if you go far enough back, is an awful lot of range. He changed the game. And so this wasn't him dealing in intangibles. It wasn't him kind of shouting in dressing rooms. He's a really verbal he's a really verbal presence, a really loud presence on the pitch, which, if you turn the sound up during these games, you can definitely hear. But this was him having a technical effect, and it was most welcome to see that.
The criticism to those sorts of votes really are more suggestive to me of what people think a footballer is, because I don't understand how you don't think that Jordan Henderson. I appreciate Kevin De Bruyne also has a fantastic season. Van Dijk has a fantastic season. Of course, in any given season, there are always a number of players who have a very good season. That's just football, right? But Jordan, football isn't all about making that pass, right? There are a lot of other aspects to it too, many of which happen off the pitch. And I think there should be more of an appreciation of that. Clearly, there is, on the basis that he won. So I don't know what I'm complaining at. I'm complaining at the backlash to the reality. Doesn't make any sense. Kepa, talk to me about Kepa though, because I mean, what the hell happened, Seb?
I think a number of things, and we've talked about this on the pod before in general terms. I think when a goalkeeper comes to a bigger club and he has a succession of bad experiences, I think something happens to him. And there are examples of goalkeepers recovering from that. David De Gea is one, clearly, because he had a very difficult start to his Manchester United career. But when he comes in, when he struggles to deal with the sort of the cliche qualities of English football, so the physicality, the congested 6-yard box, stuff like that. But when he also fails to adjust to the nature and the volume of the criticism, which, let's be fair with Kepa, has been pretty continuous. There's no argument that it's deserved, because he has not been. I mean, he's a £70 million goalkeeper, and he has been really poor. But I think he's now in a position where mentally it's probably almost impossible for him to recover. He's going to be replaced. We know this. Chelsea have already signed what they hope will be his replacement. But I think what's interesting is that if you look at him dispassionately, forget everything that's happened at Chelsea, and just look at his attributes and the things that he's good at, you can envisage a situation where he's going to recover. So the next question is, where does he go, and how does he get there? Also, because obviously £70 million, if he's allowed to leave permanently, Chelsea are going to have to swallow a huge loss. They'll be lucky to get 30 for him now, I think. And also his wages, because there are very few places, very few teams under normal conditions, sort of outside of this COVID environment. There are very few sides who would be able to spend that kind of money on a goalkeeper, or who would be willing to do so. So his career is really at a crossroads. I think the worst thing that could possibly happen to him is if he loses his place and he sits on the bench for the rest of his Chelsea contract, because then his reputation kind of calcifies, doesn't it? He becomes this guy. So when you have a bad experience, the best thing you can possibly do, and this isn't it isn't exclusive to goalkeepers, is to go somewhere and correct it really quickly, to kind of to change the narrative around you and to put a different set of highlights on YouTube ultimately. And that
We'll be
needs to
back
happen
next
with him
week with
quickly.
more life lessons from Uncle Seb. I would like. I think that's interesting. We'll probably end up talking more about this in the future, or at the point where he is replaced. So we'll return to Kepa. Feel bad for him to say that. There are two players I would like impressions on, though. We will come to Timo Werner second, because we haven't really covered Chelsea yet, have we? But first, I would like to talk about Thiago, because he is a Champions League winner, joining a team that recently won the Champions League, of course. The first thing I noticed about him when he came on at halftime to replace an injured Jordan Henderson was that he was immediately calling for the ball, which is interesting. He's obviously a very confident player and he wants to make an impression. He made some interesting passes. The fact that he wants to make an impression, though, was not lost on me or probably on any of his teammates, because he didn't have a great game. And obviously, I am not judging the quality of this particular player based on the game, but I do think it's interesting to watch how people adapt to new environments. And I felt like watching Thiago play, you could almost see, in his play, you could almost see the inside of his head, which was that I have to make a good impression here. I can show them what I'm great at, and obviously that is particularly incisive passing, being able to dictate a game, dictate the pace. He tried a couple of weird Hollywood balls that didn't really come off. He tried a couple of chips over the back. You can see how those sorts of things will work. And of course, we should preface this by saying, this is a game where you are 2-0 up, and the game is not won, but essentially based on Chelsea's lack of attacking intent, they didn't really feel like there was much threat at that point. He did give the penalty away. He seemed very, very keen to impress. And overall, despite that sort of leading to not having the best game, that's probably a good sign, right, Alex?
Yeah, look, I think Thiago has been the subject of pretty fervid conversation. Obviously, there's a wider narrative here about the degree to which FSG are prepared to invest in Liverpool, and there's a perception among a body of fans that they, not that they rest on their laurels, but they don't necessarily invest in the team in quite the way they could do to drive the team forwards, and they trust in the system and they trust in Klopp's ability to get the best out of existing players. But that's not a team that's been refreshed beyond the marquee signings of Van Dijk and Alisson, particularly. So there's a lot of expectation around Thiago to come in and to be able to do that, to refresh the team, to give it something different, and also to provide a greater degree of creativity from midfield. And I think if teams sit deep against Liverpool, sometimes, occasionally, it's harder to break them down, and Thiago's passing will be part of that. So there's he comes into the team with expectations, and I think it's understandable that he wants to make that impression. At the same time, this is a player who has just won the Champions League, has been part of a hugely successful Bayern team for a number of seasons, who was the one signing that Pep Guardiola was absolutely desperate to make when he moved to Bayern, and who does add all of those things, with the caveat of the occasional injury problem, I think. It will take him a little bit of time to adapt, and obviously there's a fitness thing. I think this game was ideally situated for him because he was playing against 10 men and Liverpool were already well in control of the game. So in terms of being introduced, it makes sense. And I guess in that regard, it was an opportunity to try some of those things and to see how they work. And I think you're absolutely right that in due course, those sorts of passes will come off with a greater degree of regularity. Obviously, the stat that everyone points to is that he made more passes in one half of football than anybody in the Chelsea team had managed previously. So, he's going to add that to Liverpool. I think the interesting thing is how the balance of that midfield works. And, what Thiago will bring is the passing, but also this intelligence in defence, the ability immediately to transition defence into attack. And Liverpool are already a fantastic team in transition. It's just a question, I think, of getting him fit, bedding him in, and and allowing that kind of natural confidence to not take a battering, and ease him in, so that when these things come or don't come off, it's not a massive problem. It's not in a high pressure game. But Klopp will manage that process intelligently, I have no doubt.
Yeah, okay. Talking of midfield balance, I would quickly like to address a situation with, or an issue, I think, with Chelsea that I noticed during the game before we talk about Timo Werner, which is that I just don't get the balance. I mean, I think we talked about this before. Kante was often in this game the second furthest player forward. Havertz was dropping off a lot from that. I guess not really the centre forward position, but almost the number 10 position with no one ahead of him. And Timo Werner was cutting inside from the left a lot, which subsequently meant that Kante was the player from that midfield three that was running past him. And there was a particular moment about 60 minutes into the game, 2-0 down. Werner cuts inside and fires a brilliant pass through the line to Kante, who just shouldn't be there. I mean, I love him, and he's amazing at what he does. But honestly, it was an incredible pass. It was one of those passes that had that pace on it, but a good player could turn it in one. It wasn't so fast that if Callum Wilson was there, for example, he could turn the defender behind him in one touch. And whereas Kante kind of receives it and then sort of tries to turn and then loses it. It's not a criticism because it's not his game. I just don't understand why he's there. I don't get why you wouldn't want a midfielder who's better suited to those sorts of positions to be there. Because I feel that within the game, although Chelsea were very flat as a team and generally speaking, didn't threaten Liverpool. Certainly, the two teams seem to be some distance apart in terms of overall quality. It's not like they didn't create any opportunities. There were chances there. This was one of them. And if the right player was in that position, I feel like that's potentially a goal, and those sorts of things make a huge difference. I don't get the balance. I don't know who wants to pick that up, Alex.
I don't think Chelsea have got the balance yet, and I think this is a problem that really proliferates the team. And I know we got some criticism after a previous podcast where Seb and I discussed how integrating all of these sumptuous attacking talents was going to be tricky for Chelsea, but clearly, Havertz played as a kind of very deep false nine in this game. He started on the wing in the previous game. There is a lack of, an immediate sense of where these players are going to start on a week in, week out basis. I think also further back with midfield, you have the problem that Chelsea are not particularly good at transitioning the ball forwards without Jorginho, but if you play Jorginho, then you have to play a midfield three, arguably, because he needs the protection. That automatically means that Kante is going to be in one of these flanking positions and asked to get forwards. So there's a kind of legacy there of when Sarri brought Jorginho in to be that controlling passer, and the rest of the midfield had to adapt around that. Lampard's been left with that situation without Jorginho in that progressing role. Arguably, you would put Kante at the base of that midfield to screen, and then you could have, Kovacic and Mount either side, for example, which I think would work really neatly. But then you're asking that midfield to progress the ball largely through carrying rather than passing. So then where is the progressive passing coming from? I think, it's very, very difficult with particularly the curtailed pre-season due to the pandemic and so on. But if I were Lampard, I would have been looking at who was coming in and the way I wanted to play and kind of really trying to nail that down and then stick with it. It seems like there's still, okay, we're only 2 games into the season, but it seems like there's a lot of chopping and changing happening, and there's an uncertainty about the best way, not just to integrate the new players, but actually how to play as a system as a whole. He played as a 3-man back line in the FA Cup final, and straight away we're sort of moving towards something different. It just seems like he doesn't quite have a handle on things at the moment, and that's why Kante is cropping up in weird positions, and I think they need to go back to the drawing board a little bit.
On a very positive note, Timo Werner, Seb, he's going to score goals, right? I mean, I know in this game the luck didn't quite drop for him, but goodness me, he's a strange player to watch. from a physical perspective. He has this kind of hunched appeal. You notice that his arms just don't move, and I think that's what, as soon as you said that, I thought, God, that's true. He has them at a sort of 90-degree angle, but they don't move. They move only from the elbow down. It's very weird. But the speed with which his feet reach the ball, this man is going to score goals, isn't he?
I think so. I think what struck me once we got past our, look how he runs funny analysis, which is, our kind of,
we're very good at
peak
that
for the weekend. Exactly. I think what I noticed about him is his center of gravity. If you put a pint glass on his head and asked him to run sort of 50 yards at top speed, would he spill a drop? Because he has that sort of it means that he can shift direction with the ball at his feet. He seems to have a really a really short backlift when he gets his shots off, and obviously there's that pace. And in a league like the Premier League, where physical attributes are at a premium, God, he looks lethal. And obviously saw his sort of technical finishing ability a little bit in Germany, and he's going to score goals. But I'm just really interested to see how he's used, because it feeds into the conversation we've just had, really, about balance, about how you format this Chelsea side right, so that the right elements are in the right parts of the pitch. But yeah, he looks fabulous. It's pretty difficult not to be envious of a player like that, actually.
He also just looked desperate to make something happen. I think Havertz is going to take a little longer to bed in, and he'll be more system dependent and perhaps be more, require more from other players. But Timo Werner just seems like a player who, when the other 10 players on his team aren't getting anywhere, he could still score a wonder goal.
I think so. I mean, the only asterisk I place against that is that I feel like, because of how much money he's cost, and because there are a few balance issues for Chelsea, I feel like he's in a position to kind of bear the brunt of maybe some early criticism for Chelsea. It reminds me a little bit of, do you remember when Dennis Bergkamp joined Arsenal? And he went through that sequence. I forget how many games, but it was a considerable number of games without scoring. And a lot of people, even back then, which is kind of the mid-90s, a lot of the tendencies that exist today were in rotation. So, words like fraud and, he can't score. And he played this game at Leeds where the Leeds goalkeeper got sent off and he still couldn't score. And that was a headline. And it wasn't really anything to do with Bergkamp. And Werner, obviously, completely different type of player. But when you cost a lot of money, when you're a name, and when you play for a side like that, I think it's really, really important just to score. And that over-eagerness, like that desperation to impress that you mentioned, I felt like, remember that chance where Havertz broke through and he's offside, but squared the ball and Werner scuffed his shot wide. There's a little bit of a lack of poise about him at the moment. So he does everything up until the point of scoring really, really well. And then there's just a kind of a slight over-eagerness, which will fall away and melt away in time, I'm sure. But yeah, what a player.
Yeah, fantastic. Hey, listen, gang, I have to go because I'm a very busy and very important person. But Seb and Alex, do you mind staying to do the last?
We shall cover, yes.
You press on to the Tifo Derby. I wish you all the best. Thanks for listening, everyone. And I'm leaving halfway through. Au revoir.
So behind the curtain, it's also Joe's birthday on the day we're recording. So that's a little birthday treat for him. Have 15 minutes off. Don't record. Just go and do whatever it is that Joe does when he's not working for Tifo. Alex, Tifo Derby though. Why oh why is your football team so shit?
Yeah, all of my my pre-season ebullience is melting away. Insofar as I'm ever ebullient, I think
that's not a word I associate with you. I'll be honest.
No, it's not, is it? I mean, this boiled down to one thing and one thing only, really, which was a wildly high defensive line that decided that it wouldn't adapt in the face of clear exploitation for some reason. Hasenhüttl said in the post-game press conference that he wants to play a high line. He's shifting towards this as a means of stifling the opposition, presumably because it fits in with the gegenpressing model of compacting the pitch, seeking to force turnovers and high pressure regains further up the pitch. So it does make sense in that regard. But as was pointed out last season, Jan Bednarak and Jack Stevens are not the best defenders for that sort of system. They can be exposed for their lack of pace. Bednarak is a much better defender in a kind of low block, backs against the wall, high volume of clearances, high volume of blocks. But here with Harry Kane dropping off into a space where, Romeo, first of all, wasn't really quick enough to dominate that space. And then after his first yellow card, he was hooked, or quite a bit after his first yellow card, actually, but he was treading a fairly
quite lucky
line
to avoid a second yellow card.
I think so. I mean, he just, this is always the issue with Romeo, is that there's a lot of things that he does quite well. He reads the game quite well. He's positionally not too bad. He doesn't have the pace or energy that Højbjerg had in that position. And, there's a reason why, by and large, Romeo was effectively the deputy for Højbjerg rather than somebody that will play alongside him. So I think, if Southampton are going to persist with this high defensive line, and the reasons for it do make sense, then Salisu is going to have to come into the side sooner rather than later, and they are still in the hunt for that quicker, more dynamic central midfielder that can line up alongside Ward-Prowse and offer the same sort of ball recovery, screening and positional intelligence that Højbjerg demonstrated in that system.
Explain something to me, because I think I don't think this is particularly controversial. The game changes on Tottenham's equaliser. Now, there's a couple of bits in there that really confuse me tactically. First of all, Southampton have the lead, deservedly. They're a better team in the first half. Tottenham are absolutely dreadful. Lovely goal from Danny Ings. The first point of confusion is, in that position, why are two players pressing Ndombele? Because Ndombele wants to be pressed. Like, when he's got the ball in that position, the way he's most effective is by skipping through the press with, in this instance, wonderful bit of balance, fabulous bit of skill, all the things that we know he can do. The second thing is, at that point of a game where I think there's probably about 2 minutes left until half time, they have the lead, they've been dominant. Why is the defensive line there against players? Really, I mean, my theory on Tottenham is I found that game really conflicting because I still don't think they're any good. I still don't think they created anything. They just took what they were given. They took what they were given like 5 times, but then they were the same goals. So what's the explanation for that? Is that just a collective brain freeze? What is the intention there at that point in the game? Because as game management, it's very difficult to rationalize.
Yeah, and I think game management is one of the areas where Southampton are very hot and cold. This slightly when Carl Anka was writing about Southampton last season, he would regularly refer to this kind of chaotic energy, which is the situation in which Ralph's teams tend to thrive. Where the press is quite frantic, where the opportunities to hoover up second balls and break at pace are what they're looking for. And that means that when there are instances like for that equal, I mean, you're absolutely right in terms of pressing and Ndombele. That is just, I think, a kind of reflexive. The guy's got the ball, we go press him. There's a lack of intelligence around the specific threat offered by that player, which is as a press breaking midfielder, absolutely. But I also think that Southampton's ability to react situationally, by and large, unless it's swung massively the other way, and we did see towards the end of last season, particularly against the 2 Manchester teams, a very, very good, intelligent, backs to the wall defensive performance. But it seems like Southampton either do one or the other. They're either like high octane, chaotic, high press, which was how they started that game and played really well, or they're a backs to the wall, trying to protect a 1-0 lead, clearing everything through Bednarak. there isn't really enough maturity in that team at the moment, I think, to assess the situation and go, okay, well, we're 1-0 up. We've got 2 minutes left. Let's just sit a little bit deeper. Let's just try and control the game a little bit more, keep possession. Southampton don't really have players who are adept at keeping possession. It's not how the game plan works. And I think, Southampton's best players in that first half were people like Genpo, who are there to grab the ball, drive at the opposition, press intelligently, create issues through their movement. It's not about getting your foot on the ball and playing it around. Southampton did that a little bit, but it's not their natural state. And I think Tottenham, whether they kind of figured that out as the game went on, or whether they just realised that, Kane was going to have the upper hand dropping off, I'm not entirely sure. But Southampton didn't alter, and I think that speaks to a lack of in-game intelligence, exactly like you highlight.
So I'm not a Jose Mourinho fan. I think that's been made fairly clear over this podcast series. What I will say,
and also your all or nothing video,
my all or nothing video, my general output, pretty much everything I've ever written on Jose Mourinho is kind of testifies to that attitude. What I will
consistent.
say, exactly. I'm nothing if not consistent. What I will say is credit for the halftime change, because a couple of things. Very clearly, as the second half attests to, there was a strategic determination to use Harry Kane in a slight deeper position and use him as a pivot for Son Heung-min. The second part of that change, which was kind of forced by a conditioning issue with Tanguy Ndombele, who's not quite ready to play more than probably about 45 minutes of a Premier League game. Also won a yellow card at half-time. But he brought on Giovanni Lo Celso, who... difference between Lo Celso and Ndombele for me is the way Lo Celso snaps his passes. Really good ball carrier, wonderful player to watch. He's kind of that sort of number 10 ideal, with a nasty little edge to him. He's quite a nasty little player, which is the kind of the ideal of the old Argentinian South American number 10. But one of the features, certainly in the building of the lead, certainly up to a 3-4-1, was Lo Celso picking up passes, in turnover situations, snapping a pass into Kane, and then Son exploiting the space behind him. But that being said, the defense worries me, Alex. Like, it's like watching, I said this on Twitter, it's like watching someone defend with a table football team, where the only option is to kind of slide your players in front of shots, and that's it. There's nothing else, because Tottenham, even when they even when the game was won, they just look so vulnerable. And I can't, and this goes for my Tottenham supporting friends as well, between us, we cannot come up with a convincing argument as to why Eric Dyer and Davinson Sanchez would start a Premier League game together. Like, Eric Dyer, nice guy, lots to admire about him as a person. Not a very good centre-half. I mean, I don't see what Mourinho is trying to do, because I feel also like your only guarantee with Mourinho is solidity. That's the deal that you make. You're going to watch fairly negative football, but the result of that is clean sheet, solidity, this general sense of security. We're almost 10 months in. I don't see any of that. If anything, it's getting more porous. Discuss.
No, I agree, and I think it's worth pointing out that were it not for a very, very good save from Hugo Lloris and a very, very good block from Ben Davis, both off Che Adams' opportunities, you could have been 3-0 down.
Absolutely.
So, those instances are coming off the exploitation of the space in behind. Lloris is a fine keeper, but
chaotic.
He's not.
He's a reactive goalkeeper.
Yeah, he's a reactive, old-fashioned, good shot stopper on the line kind of goalkeeper. He's not the sort of person you want charging out as that weird headed thing up onto Danny Ings' arm showed. I don't understand the Eric Dyer thing either. I can only assume that there are two reasons for it. The first is that he is arguably too slow to play as a pivot. And the second is that because he very much wants to be a centre-back, Mourinho is trying to not curry favour, but shore up a position in the dressing room by acceding to that. those are the only rational explanations that I can find for it, really, because it's not working. It didn't particularly work for England either, and it just seems like an odd one to me. But I think this Spurs performance, it masked their inadequacies.
False economy all over. Like
anything, Son Heung-min is a phenomenal footballer, and there is literally nothing not to like about him. I agree that Lo Celso was very good when he came on, and he's a player that I would be building my Tottenham side around were I Jose Mourinho. But 5-2 flattered you. And I think that there's still, after that abject performance against Everton, I'd say, I'll wrap it up with this, that when last season Southampton had the 9-0 defeat against Leicester, and then the next game lost 2-1 at home to Everton, which by any given measure was a better result, but actually a worse performance. If you saw the game, you'd know what I mean. And I think Spurs got a 5-2 win here as opposed to losing, but there was no sense of, other than some excellent interplay by two players doing something repeatedly well, there was no sense of progression here. It was, in many ways, the first half of that performance was actually worse than the game against Everton. And Southampton should have been comfortably away. So, if I'm a Spurs fan, yes, there's still an intrinsic level of quality in that squad that I guess would give me some hope, but I'm not really seeing a plan at this point, and that would be concerning.
It was like the little bits of quality that the system couldn't quite crush, basically. I remember I texted you during the game to say that I think that this was actually more embarrassing than the 9-0 to Leicester, just because you shouldn't be conceding 5 goals at home to a Jose Mourinho team. It's just...
This is correct.
This is correct. Anyway, producer Adonis wants us to wrap up. So without Joe, it always gets a little bit weird because he does the awkward ending better than anybody. But please join us at another time for something slightly different, but also quite similar. Goodbye.